One day while recording, Pink Floyd were visited in the studio by a strange bald man with shaved eyebrows. His behaviour was bizarre, but when Roger Waters realised who the man was, he burst into tears. It was former band member Syd Barrett, who'd left the band 7 years before. But his sudden appearance and strange behaviour wasn't even the worst part of the unsolicited studio visit. Many consider Syd Barrett Pink Floyd's guiding light, but the truth is he was only with them for a tiny fraction of their history. What ended his time with Pink Floyd was an abrupt and bizarre personality change that fans are still trying to come to terms with. Suggested causes include his unbridled drug use, mental illness, or just one of the side effects of being a rock and roll genius. Syd Barrett was born Roger Keith Barrett in Cambridge, England on January 6, 1946. As a teenager, he gained the nickname Syd and also a taste for collecting instruments. First it was a ukulele, then a banjo, an acoustic guitar, and finally his holy grail, an electric guitar. Just before Barrett turned 16, his father died of cancer. Around the same time, all 4 of his siblings moved out to start their adult lives. Barrett had gone from a home full of familial warmth to a cold and empty house, and the losses left a gaping hole. To distract him from his grief, Barrett's mum had an idea, one that would alter the future of rock music forever. At this time, Barrett was playing in a band called Jeff Mott and the Mottos, and his mum had the idea for the band to perform their music right in the living room. One of Barrett's school friends came over to watch them play. His name was Roger Waters. Waters was a musician himself, and seeing Barrett's potential, eventually asked him to join his band, T-Set. At one of their first gigs, they showed up and discovered that there was already a band named T-Set on the bill. What are the chances? In desperate need of a new name, Barrett thought about his 2 favourite blues artists, Pink Anderson and Floyd Council, and came up with the Pink Floyd sound. Being in a band was all Barrett wanted in life, but along with it came a very dangerous pastime. Being in the music scene at this time involved drug use, and Barrett got into it early. He hadn't reached 20 years old when he first used psychedelics. Around this time, Barrett was living in a flat in London's South Kensington neighbourhood. There's no shortage of stories that have surfaced about Barrett while living in this flat. There's the one about his roommates locking him in a linen closet while he was having a bad trip, and some say he locked his girlfriend in a room for 3 days. Rumours have it that when she came out of her imprisonment, Barrett smashed her over the head with his guitar. The thing about these stories, however, is that it's hard to tell truth from fiction. Barrett's roommates were likely as high as he was and weren't the most reliable sources. One thing was for sure, Barrett was off the deep end, but he still had a ways to go before he hit rock bottom. Pink Floyd soon became the house band at a psychedelic club called UFO. Sometimes when there was a smaller crowd, the inimitable Barrett would do something outrageous for a rock star. He would recite Shakespeare, specifically Hamlet's to be or not to be soliloquy. Apparently his performance was quite moving. Pink Floyd advertised their shows with all kinds of psychedelic references, including Timothy Leary's Turn On, Tune In, Drop Out. So when Barrett jumped on stage and performed a bizarre nursery rhyme freakout, the crowd went wild. Barrett was having a blast just doing whatever he wanted to. During this pivotal time in Barrett's life, he was dating a woman named Jenny Spires. One thing that he didn't know was that Spires was also seeing someone else. Her secret affair was with filmmaker and counterculture expert Peter Whitehead. It's usually impossible to find a silver lining when your girlfriend is cheating on you, but Barrett didn't have to look very hard. Spires was concocting a devious plan that would take Pink Floyd to the next level. Whitehead was making a counterculture film called Tonight Let's All Make Love in London. The film already had the Rolling Stones on board, as well as counterculture artists like Allen Ginsberg and David Hockney. Spires used her charms and convinced Whitehead to film Pink Floyd's song Interstellar Overdrive. The film went on to be the hit of the 1967 New York Film Festival, and this publicity would help Pink Floyd get their first album. Once The Piper at the Gates of Dawn came out and was a success, things changed for Barrett and Pink Floyd. Suddenly their management team was desperately looking for the next big hit and putting intense pressure on Barrett to write it. If you asked most people who knew him, they'd say that Barrett was usually full of joy, friendly and mostly extroverted. In the late 60s, something changed. People noticed he suffered from depression, seemed introverted, and was hallucinating. He began slurring his speech, and sometimes he even went completely catatonic. Some people mentioned that Barrett's eyes were vacant, and that it was like someone reached inside his head and turned off the switch. Of course, everyone wanted to know what had happened. At the time, some friends thought that they could pinpoint Barrett's personality change to one single event. They say that Barrett went missing for an entire long weekend, and when he came back, he was a completely different person. What happened on that weekend remains a mystery, but Pink Floyd now had a very difficult band member on their hands. With a big US tour coming up, Pink Floyd had to fix whatever was wrong with Barrett. Even though they needed him to promote the new album, Pink Floyd's management made the decision to send Barrett on vacation. They rushed him and his girlfriend to a beautiful island in the Mediterranean. Along for the ride were chaperones to make sure Barrett stayed out of trouble. The success of this forced vacation would immediately be put to the test when Barrett joined his bandmates in America. His arrival in Los Angeles set the tone for the US tour. First, he mistook LA for Las Vegas, then announced that he'd forgotten his guitar. Then he followed that up by falling into a swimming pool. In short, Barrett was a mess, and this mess was about to go on broadcast television. When Pink Floyd did publicity on the very conservative Pat Boone show, Barrett was so out of it that he couldn't even manage to lip sync. What wasn't clear was whether Barrett was high or just angry about appearing on this very square TV show. He continued his phoned-in performances on American Bandstand. It quickly became clear that host Dick Clark had no idea what to make of Barrett as he gave his monosyllabic responses. For the US tour, Barrett had for some reason opted to get a perm and was now regretting it. By the time of their Santa Monica concert, he'd had it with the perm and wanted to change it. Playing the role of his own hairdresser, he dumped an entire container of Brill cream on his head. The heat from the concert lighting quickly melted the Brill cream, and it started to run down his face. Female fans at the front of the crowd saw him and screamed in terror. Barrett's bandmates had reached the end of their rope. They needed to do something about him, and fast. Back at home, they tried to give Barrett major hints that he should quit, but this tactic was falling on deaf ears. It was soon time to tour again, and the band was nervous. This was a UK tour with Jimi Hendrix, and it had a brutal schedule. The fear was that this would be a repeat of the last US tour. As it turned out, it was much worse. During the UK tour, Barrett threw the band more than a few curveballs. On some occasions he arrived but was unable to function, other times he didn't arrive at all. Even when Barrett did show up for gigs, he sometimes did almost nothing on stage. It was embarrassing, and the band came up with an ingenious way to fix it. They hired a new band member to cover for Barrett if he couldn't play or chose not to. Pink Floyd ended up hiring Barrett's own best buddy, David Gilmour. But if Barrett felt offended over this, he didn't show it, at least not at first. It appeared to be a win-win situation because having Gilmour there allowed Barrett to participate or not, whichever he wanted. The problem was that Gilmour was too good, and suddenly Pink Floyd didn't need Barrett at all. Firing anyone is difficult. Firing an unstable man from a band he helped create was going to be monumental. Pink Floyd did eventually let Barrett go. The only thing was that in his foggy brain, Barrett didn't really understand that he was fired. On more than one occasion, he embarrassingly showed up at venues ready to play. When they told him he wasn't going on stage, He sat down in the front row and angrily glared at Gilmour for the entire show. Once Barrett actually realised he was no longer a part of Pink Floyd, his life began a slow spiral downward. Around this time, Barrett was living in London and had found a new hobby. It was shopping. He had a ritual of going to Harrods and buying some enormously expensive items. Once he got his stuff home, he would grow tired of it and just hand it over to the apartment caretaker. This was an immensely expensive hobby, and Barrett soon found himself with no money. Of course, almost everyone in Barrett's life wanted to help him. His friends tried to get him into treatment, but he refused. Pink Floyd's management tried to get him to make music, but he seemed unable to do it. By 1968, Barrett was still broke, and worse still, he was now homeless. A homeless Barrett soon turned up at his mum's house in Cambridge, where he promptly moved into the basement. His deluded thinking soon conjured up bizarre images of the prying eyes of the media and fans. To deal with his hallucinations, he boarded up the windows. Barrett was quickly going mad, but he had one last trick up his sleeve. He attempted a solo career, but after 2 albums, he called it quits. To make it perfectly clear he'd given up on music, he dropped the name Syd and went back to Roger. Years later, when a radio DJ mistakenly called him Syd, he replied, "Syd can't talk to you now." Just like Elvis, Syd Barrett had left the building. In the 1980s, Barrett started having angry outbursts and checked himself into a facility. When he returned home, his mother couldn't deal with his outbursts anymore. She moved in with her daughter, and Barrett was left on his own. His mother had always been his rock. Without her, there was no telling what would happen. Surprisingly, living alone in his mum's house seemed to work for Barrett. He returned to his love of painting and started new hobbies. He was collecting coins and learning how to cook. He regularly met his mum in town and they'd go shopping together. Life was looking rather ordinary, but for Barrett, ordinary seemed like the only choice that worked. Sadly, his happiness would be short-lived, as fate would soon deliver him a new tragedy. In 1991, Barrett's mother died. She was an important constant in his life, and her passing set him off on a dark and bizarre mission. He started by chopping down the fence and only tree in her front garden. In his misery, he made a pile of the debris and lit it ablaze. Next, he took his old art books and diaries and destroyed them. All of this was a way to get through his profound sorrow. Now he had to pick up the pieces and see what he could make of his life. To deal with the loss of his mother, Barrett threw himself more deeply into painting. He worked outdoors, mostly because his canvases were extremely large, but there was a major drawback. Overzealous fans would climb the fence at night and take his brushes. Aside from this annoyance, however, life was good. Roger Barrett finally found a way to be in the world. Then he got an ominous call from his doctor. When he was just over 50, Barrett visited the doctor and found he had type B diabetes. This was apparently genetic, and to overcome it, he simply needed to change his diet and take medication. For a complicated man like Barrett, this was too much to ask. He sporadically followed doctor's orders, but often didn't. In the end, it was cancer that took Barrett's life at the age of 60. When remembering him, the media at the time chose to refer to his psychedelic drug-induced breakdown. In fact, most people focus on this as the reason for his mental collapse. Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here contains a tribute to Barrett that takes up most of the album. It's called Shine On You Crazy Diamond. Back in 1975, a dishevelled man walked into the studio while Pink Floyd were recording. It took the band 45 minutes to realise the strange man was Syd. He was heavier and he had shaved his head and his eyebrows. When Roger Waters realised that this man was actually Barrett, he was so troubled by his friend's appearance that he burst into tears. Richard Wright said, "We hadn't seen him for 2 years, and for some incredible reason he picked the very day that we were doing a song about him." Barrett left the studio later that day without saying goodbye. and it was one of the last times any of his old bandmates ever saw him. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.